Yep.
Thank you guys for joining us tonight. We have Mike Houghton, Mike, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, give us any relevant background information.
Yep. So thanks everybody for coming out. Really appreciate it. And my name is Mike Houghton. I'm the user experience lead at Kyra Solutions. I am now going to need to push pause because, well, you know what? I'm just going to keep going. I lost my slides. I'm going to talk for the next, I don't know, 30 minutes or so, probably less, about user experience design, in particular, 3 aspects of it, the elements, the process, and the relationships related to UX over the course of my career. I'm gonna having some trouble with my monitor. There we go. Let me just jump right in. So I've been working in UX now for 20 something years. And I'm going to rewind for you all to where I started working when I was 14 years old. I was bagging groceries at Publix. My dad was a manager of Publix. His dad was a manager of Publix. And as I guess all of you know, Publix is about making shopping a pleasure. That's way back to the very beginning of the store. And so when I began working as a bag boy, I took notice of the store and how it was designed. The way that the aisles are laid out is kind of like browse when you get to user experience. Going up and talking to a bag boy and trying to find where something is very much like search. So I sort of trace my love for UX and the way of customer service, user experience, all the way back to when I was 14. So the first of the 3 parts, we're going to talk about the elements. I studied visual design at Florida State back in the day. It was called visual communication. And what I learned about were the basics of visual design: typography, color, layout, patterns, images, and contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. So that's the base from which I learned my way. And then I got into my first job, and it was designing screens for computers. And as you can see from this diagram by Jesse James Garrett, this goes back to 2000, the elements of user experience. What I had learned was the very top, visual design. There was a whole lot more to learn. The layers underneath it: information design, interface design, navigation design, and so forth. That all had to come over the course of my career. And then I learned over time that UX gets bigger than that. Jesse James Garrett later created a diagram that has this whole experience as a human, experience design, the design of anything, independent of medium, across media. So perception, emotion, action, and cognition all come together in all of these various fields. So what I felt I need to learn continued to grow. This is Jared Spool, and he focuses on experience design. And so experience design goes in all kinds of areas beyond what I learned back in the day at FSU. My particular career has taken me to these 4 areas. I've done more than this, but information architecture, visual design, interaction design, and prototyping, that's sort of the core of what I do. Within that world, I thought it'd be interesting to share my favorite definition of design, and that's again from Jared Spool, that design is the rendering of intent. I especially appreciate the intent. That's sort of the goals, the reasons why you're doing the thing, and the rendering is the actual thing that you create. So experience design is huge, and it could be taken in just about any direction. And this, idea gets curved a little bit by Liz Sanders when she talks about like, whoa, 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 let's slow down. You can't design experience. What you design is for experience. And I guess that's sort of a subtle distinction, but I appreciated what she had to say about designing for an experience. You're not actually controlling people's experience. You're designing for those experiences so that they can be enjoyable and get things done. I'm guessing many of you may have seen this diagram, the overlap of desirability, viability, feasibility. It's the bullseye for design that was put out by IDEO. And kind of related to that, three more circles that you may be familiar with are the golden circle. I highly recommend Simon Sinek's TED Talk, starting with the why, going out to the how, and then to the what, the thing that you actually make. So bringing it into the realm of UX design instead of experience, some of the items are concept models, interaction design, information, architecture, UI or user interface design. But again, you can kind of see that quote at the bottom. If UX is the experience that a user has while interacting with your product, then UX design is by definition the process by which we determine what that experience will be. This is Ralph Ammer. He's one of my favorite designers, and I love to read his articles in particular because he intersperses animation with them. This is another way to look at Simon Sinek's concentric circles. If you look at the bottom, that's the why. And then you go out to the how, the process by which you make the thing. And then ultimately, craft is the thing that you make. So I thought that was an interesting take on the same concentric circles. Values for UX design. This is Peter Morville, and you can see his design honeycomb. The core, again, related to the Simon Sinek talk, is valuable. But then around it, is it useful, desirable, accessible, credible, findable, usable? So this is a pretty helpful reminder, foundational element that I use as I move forward with my design work. But I recently stumbled upon an article by a guy named Tobias Van Schneider, and it kind of adds to the honeycomb. He says, make it opinionated. And without an opinion, you don't have, you'd get lost in the morass of everything else. You need to have a unique voice, a unique personality, an opinion to what you do. I love this example of how UX could be seen as breakfast. It's kind of probably hard to read on your screen, but in the upper left, there's the server. That's all the data, all of the corn flakes, the Rice Krispies or whatever. And then to the right of that, the product team kind of breaks that out into its individual pieces, including the bowl and the spoon and the little container you might pour the milk with. And then in the bottom left, user interface, the spoon. You dig into the cereal and you eat it. To the right, UX, that's the whole thing coming together. That's breakfast. And I'd even add a layer to that with apologies to Ed Leah. UX is like, and for those of you who understand this, kudos to people who know Mikey is in the Life cereal commercial. But it's the whole experience of eating the cereal in the room. So a little bit broader take on what UX is. And some people sometimes call themselves UX/UI designers. And then you might have seen something like UI is JV UX. It's like the old school ketchup bottle, and UX is the new fancy ketchup bottle. Well, that's fundamentally a mistake. Those are both user interfaces. One just happens to be a little more modern and easier to use. The product is the ketchup inside, and the experience is when you eat it with your fries or whatever. So I digressed there. Moving on to the psychology of UX. This is Dave Gray, the founder of Explain. He has a great video about what he calls liminal thinking. So it's sort of that layer right where consciousness and subconsciousness or subliminal experience happens. And so paying attention to that as a UX designer, with what people believe, their judgments, their theories, all of that comes packaged with them, and trying to pay attention to that and empathize with that as you begin to build your product. I worked for 9 years at homes.com. and I was the director of design in general there. And over another concentric set of circles, over the course of my time there, I developed this diagram to express the way in which design fit into the larger context of the company. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and you can see sort of this outer layer is the business, and that's the leadership of the company, casting vision, goals, objectives, etc. And then inside of that, there's these 4 layers that are what I would call the product team, within which is design, that was my group, development, and data, and systems. And so we would build the product. Inside of that is 3 more layers: the marketing team, the sales team, the customer support and service team. And then inside of that were our customers. So what happened was the people who were on the phone, in particular, the customer support team, they were like our UX research team, because they were always talking with customers about pain points or ideas to make things better. And in a way, the sales and marketing team did the same thing. They served the same function. They were always listening to the people using our product. And then that information would bubble out to the product team. And then in my sense, it would be the design side of that. And how do we make the design better as a team? So happy to, we'll do questions at the end, but if you want to dig into any of this, like this might be one to dig in a little deeper on. Yeah, put your questions down or pass them along, and we'll try to get to them at the end. So the second part I'd like to talk about are just design processes in general, making the thing over time. And one of my favorite diagrams that shows the process of design is from a guy named Damian Newman, and it's called the design squiggle. And on the left is chaos, and then it gets refined, fine-tuned, becomes concrete. So on the left, abstract, on the right, concrete. So you can see a little bit more uncertainty, patterns begin to emerge, insights begin to emerge, clarity and focus over the course of time. Another example of the design process is from Julie Zhu. And I thought this was interesting because it breaks or delineates between a junior designer's process and a senior designer's process. The junior designer's process is kind of meandering and a little bit like the design squiggle, but it just stays squiggly until you're done. The senior designer goes down discrete paths and just says no or yes. And if it's no, you go back to the hub and move forward to the next point and to the next point, or maybe to another no, and then back and forth, refining and refining until you're finished. Maybe the most popular design diagram is from the Design Council. It's also called the double diamond. On the left are things you don't know, just like your starting point. On the right, things you do know and the end point. So to add a little more layer of information to that, on the left, it's like the question, are we designing the right thing? And then on the right is the answer, designing the thing right. And both of those have this process of expanding, looking at alternatives, other ideas, new ideas, coming to, I don't know, a critical mass of what you think you need to have in mind. And then you begin to refine down to a point in the middle. The HMY stands for how might we. So how might we do this thing? And then you begin another expansion, new ideas. What are we going to try? You begin to prototype those ideas, and things begin to diverge again towards your answer, your final product. To add a little bit more complexity or information to that, there's a full diagram that you can get, and I'll try to share the slide deck, or at least the links in the deck. I know I have a bunch of links here, but just helpful, more information about this sort of multi-diamond expansion, contraction process towards design. Most companies that are larger have their own process. And so this is one example, Frog Design, an amazing company that has sort of a verb-based, seek, imagine, make, plan, build all around the core of clarifying what it is that you're trying to build. IDEO, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with their work. They've done a ton of work about their process. They have a nonprofit arm, IDEO.org. And in that, you can see this even simpler 3-step or 3-component piece where you're inspired, then you get ideas, and then you implement those ideas. And those are very similar to, again, I'm guessing you guys have either heard some or maybe even used Eric Rice's lean startup method, which is like the scientific method. You've got a hypothesis, and then you experiment and you test it and you measure your test results. Was it successful? Yes or no? And if no, how can we refine and iterate around and around? One other resource that IDEO.org puts out is the Field Guide to Human-Centered Design. And in it, there's some great information about creative confidence, making things, learning from failure, empathy, embracing ambiguity, staying optimistic, and again, iterating, and iterating. The shortest design process that I'm aware of is the design sprint from Jake Knapp. And in a theory, or in a way, it's kind of like he's still doing the same stuff, even though he's just got idea, learn, idea, learn. It's a helpful, it's framed up as a 5-day process to go from idea to testing as quickly as possible. So I think it's pretty helpful, but it does kind of sort of go through the same steps of the other processes. I have been working with Kyra Solutions for the past 5 years. And what we do is design, well, my role is designing for government agencies. I don't know how fixed this process is across other agencies, but the projects that I've worked on generally follow this linear flow, kind of for better or worse. They start off with an RFP, a request for proposals, and that's kind of the problem statement. They've already got the problem statement done. And then they ask for proposals, and that's when our business team and tech team get together and come up with our imagined solution statement. And that's our response and how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take, et cetera. And if we're chosen, we go into the development phase where we talk about their, let's say it's a database system. One that we're working on now is measuring air pollution. So what does the current system do? The as-is system. We review that, and then we discuss what might it be, the to-be system. And the process used for gathering this information is sometimes called JRPs, Joint Requirements Planning, or JADs, Joint Application Design. But again, it's still kind of a linear process. And a lot of times the clients are saying, hey, we want this, we want that. And we say, yeah, we can build it. So it's a different take on design. It has some advantages. Things move more quickly generally, but because of that, I haven't in the projects that I've worked on gone as deeply as I would have preferred. And then from there, you have certain government agency type deliverables. And I'm going to talk more about other deliverables as well, but these are very technical ways of documenting a project. So the third and final piece that we'll talk about are relationships and relational dynamics, particularly that I've experienced over the course of my career. The first that I'd like to talk about is when a designer becomes a decorator. And by that, I just kind of threw this random design process. So don't pay as much attention to the process. Imagine it's the same, the double diamond or whatever. You begin the design process, you're kind of almost all the way done, and then you bring in a designer and you say, hey, can you make this look pretty? As a designer, that like sucks the life out of you. But what I'll often, when that happens, I just reach out and say, hey, let's talk. Let's rewind a little bit and talk about how we got here. And that'll help me give you a better design in the long run. And so that type of question is usually asked by customers that I first meet. We don't have an ongoing relationship. And over time, usually the questions that they're asking happen much earlier in the process. Another type of customer that you'll meet, and this is also me, it's just you get distracted by things and you want to redirect the process or the path that you're on. So, and I also love Up by Pixar and every other one of their movies. So This is another type of relational dynamic where, as a designer, the client becomes a designer, and they come to the table with opinions at some point, and like, hey, we need to make some changes, or can you make a few small changes? And so I'm not really sure what that means until we get into the weeds. And so this is one way of looking at the types of questions you might be asked. So there's a significant difference. I'll just go ahead and read it, between being asked by a client to rework the design to express more confidence, or being asked to change the font in the headline from Gotham Ultra to Impact. Those two distinctions, the first one, we needed to express more confidence. That's kind of a goal that we have from the beginning. Let's head towards that goal. That's a goal-oriented request, much easier to deal with, at least for me, than taste-oriented requests, when the client kind of wants to pick up the pen and make the design decisions, the taste-oriented design decisions. I just decided to add this 6 types of clients. I'll only focus on 2 of them. In the bottom center, the obsessive client. I just really can't stand the comma. Let's use a different font just for the commas. And the client that you hope for, obviously, is the dream, the bottom right, where they trust you. They say, you're the expert. I trust your opinion. Have fun and go with it. So in addition to 6 types of clients, I began thinking of types of designers, or at least roles in which a designer can play in the process. So on the left, the designer becomes a doctor. And when the designer becomes a doctor, they're very prescriptive, proud, confident. I'll just trust me, give me everything, give me the plans. I'm going to build it, do everything, and give you perfection or whatever. I'm going to jump over to the right. Designer is data entry. They're humble, but they're ambivalent. They're just like, you tell me what to do. I know how to use Photoshop or Illustrator, and I'm going to give you the thing and I'll build it for you. In the middle is what I hope for in my role, or the dynamic that I have with a client. And that's designer is dancer, both humble and confident, working together to build the thing, being trusted to do what I've learned as a designer, and entrusting them to, for example, know their customer or other things that they're the expert in. So anyways, worth consideration. I mentioned we talk a little bit more about deliverables. This is, not every project, but a pretty standard example of, from pitch, the beginning on the left, to launch on the right. Things that are created are stakeholder surveys and auditing the competition, etc. I'll talk a little bit more about the audience research or the empathy map in a second, but then content audits, site maps, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Wireframes, I'll talk a little bit more. Content styles, mock-ups, prototypes, etc. It just continues to get the product you're working on, continues to get more and more refined, more and more tangible, hands-on, visceral. The quicker I've found that you can get to a prototype, the more helpful. It's the most helpful form of documentation that I've used. Like some have said, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, a prototype is worth 1,000 pictures. Anyway, so I mentioned empathy maps. I learned about these from someone I mentioned earlier, Dave Gray, the founder of Explain and the liminal thinking guy. So this is a very helpful tool after interviewing a client or their user or both in depth, taking all of those notes and distilling them into some one-pager that I can keep on the wall taped to remind me of who it is that I'm designing for. What do they care about? What are they afraid of? What are they excited about? What do they want to get? What are their pain points and gains? So empathy maps, can't say enough about them. And I would say, if you can identify various user groups within your project, make several. The second one that I'll go in a little bit more deeply on would be a site map, information architecture. I love organizing things. And so this is one way, or a visualizing that I've used with projects that I've worked on. And then finally, I'll talk about the wireframes. And what's nice about wireframes is they can help you visualize something kind of clear, not super clear, but hopefully clear enough to communicate the general layout of the site, the types of content that are going to be on any particular screen or view. And if you notice on the bottom right, for whom will these screens matter and why? So wireframes have been helpful. One downside that I've experienced with wireframes is clients just want to see color full-on design as quickly as possible. And this could get confusing. Like, how come there's this weird square with a triangle and a circle? What does that even mean? So unless you've worked with a client before and you've dealt with wireframes and they understand what they mean and what they're trying to do, it can be a gotcha. This is what I'm going to talk about next and last is maybe a contradiction, but I think it's interesting. So Malcolm Gladwell, I'm guessing most or all of you have heard of Malcolm Gladwell. He talks about the 10,000 hour rule, and that's the sense in which it just takes a whole lot of work to become good. Or the 10,000 hour thing is for like mastery. But even to get good or great at something, it just takes time. So practice isn't the thing you do once you're good, it's the thing that makes you good. So once you have enough time in to consider yourself a designer, I love this quote from Massimo Vignelli. He's one of the designers that's impacted me the most over the course of my career. If you can design one thing, you can design everything. I love the optimism in that, in the way in which you can use the design process, the way of thinking, the way of coming up with ideas to solve many problems in many areas, not just visual problems. And that leads me to sort of my final slide, at least for a couple others that I'm going to show you related to resources you might be interested in. But everyone is a designer. Tim Brown, the chair and co-CEO of IDEO, you can read it, but I will too. Whenever we do something to improve the state of the world, we're designing. Design is everywhere. Inevitably, everyone is a designer. So there is a sense in which I hope you all feel, I don't know, invited or the opportunity to consider yourself a designer in the sense that you're able to bring ideas to the table and work with others to solve problems. A couple other resources and then we'll be done or switch over to questions. There are a lot of people that have shaped my thinking about UX design, but I wanted to mention Steve Krug. That's my favorite UI book, Don't Make Me Think. Susan Weinschenk, 100 Things is my favorite UX psychology book. Alan Cooper, About Face, my favorite interaction design book. It's kind of like the Bible of interaction design. Robert Hochman Jr. has a great UX book. I've been, for the past really 10 years, a UX team of one. Leah Bully's book is that title, UX Team of One. It's a fantastic book about UX when you're the one person working on a much larger team, wearing a lot of different hats in the realm of UX. And then every morning, I get something from the feed from UX Collective. Fabrizio Teixeira is the co-founder of that, and he also curates inbound articles. They're all excellent. It's a great resource. So with that, I'm going to say thanks to everybody for showing up. And if we have, well, time or questions or both, I think we've got plenty of time. I'm happy to answer what you got. Yeah. I can't. You want me to quit sharing my screen? Okay. All right. So let me take a look. All right. So can you explain storytelling a bit more from your first slide? If by the first slide you were referring to the public's experience, I can talk about that more. If you were referring to, I think the first slide related to UX was the Jesse James Garrett. So if you could help me there, or Caleb, if you have additional insight on that one. Okay. That's right. So when I think of the stories that I tell as a UX designer, I'll go there. They relate to when I'm doing research with users, the story of their day and how the product that I'm intending to design is going to intersect with their day. And so telling that story in various ways, either by an empathy map or coming back with research to my team to discuss the story of the person who's going to use the thing. And just as important, the story of the business that's trying to sell the thing, assuming that's not my company. Those stories need to be constantly in my mind. And we sometimes use story language in our development process. We use the agile development process for a lot of the products that I work on, but I don't think that's the heart of this question. So I see another question. What are some skills to have as a UX designer? If I were to break the necessary skills into two overly simplified buckets, one would be the visualization of the product. So being able to do anything related to, well, the visual design that I learned at FSU, color and typography and layout and all of that within the realm of screen design for an app or a big monitor for a enterprise level application. So all of those things, visual things, are the most helpful side of the UX that I do daily. And so if I were to talk to someone like, hey, you want to join our team, I would need to see examples of sites that they've built, mobile apps that they've built, or even ideas as a student, their portfolio. That's very, very helpful. Bonus points if they can translate those static visuals created in Figma or Photoshop or whatever into working prototypes. Again, you can prototype in Figma, but not so much in Photoshop. But another type of prototype that's even more helpful is something built in HTML with CSS and even a little JavaScript, because that creates the closest connection to the developer and the developer side of the house. So visuals, either static or bonus for dynamic, that's bucket one. Bucket two, research, UX research. I have so much to learn about UX research, but in general, trying to shadow or in other ways talk to the people for whom you're building the thing, taking detailed notes, and then bringing that back to build the thing. When you're done, keep talking. Like I mentioned, my experience at homes.com, having the customer service team always talking to the customers, you need a continual stream of feedback from the people that are using the thing that you build. So visual design, very helpful, bucket one. UX research, customer research in general, bucket two, super helpful. Is creating solutions for the government much more difficult than working with clients in the private sector? Interesting. The companies that I've worked with almost my whole career it's in-house. So we are the in-house design shop making the thing that we sell. The work that I've done with Kyra is an exception because the state agency teams are a client for us. So to the extent that you are building your own thing, it's kind of easier because you don't have, well, that'd be strange, but you don't have to like make your case and win the argument in the same way that you have to when you're dealing with a customer or a client. I guess the government process that maybe would be a little more difficult is it can be more rigid. The budgets can be lower and the timelines can be shorter. So in that sense, it's more difficult. I wouldn't say the timelines are necessarily, but yeah, it can be more rigid. I'll just leave it there. And then so in the extent that working for private customers, you've got a little more flexibility in theory, I think would be a little bit less difficult in that regard. Okay. Interesting. Well, if you're not, I'm assuming you're not able to do that yourself, then honestly, some people begin user testing with like just sketches, napkin sketches or whatever. It's super low fidelity prototyping. So you can make the paper prototypes. That's a way of refining your product. But I think what you're hoping to do at some point, and you should, is add much more fidelity to your design. And that can, if you don't know how to do that visualization yourself with Figma or Adobe XD or Photoshop Illustrator, you need to find someone who can help you with that. But I wouldn't slow down. Again, lo-fi paper-based prototypes are legit, and they can help you refine your idea, improve your idea is a good one. Yeah, the design diamond looks a lot like the design thinking model. I think they're the same thing or based on the same thing. I would guess that the double diamond maybe came first. I don't really know. But I do know that they are very, very connected. The way of design thinking and the way of that design council's double diamond are totally in harmony with one another, if not the same thing. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yep, very much a design thinking type of process, visualization of a process. Okay, sounds great. A good budget to have for someone starting out who wants to hire a UX designer. So if that means what would a starting UX designer need to make? I haven't hired another designer. I mentioned I've been a UX team of one for about 10 years. I honestly don't know, but I know where I would look to answer that question is Glassdoor. It has so much information about jobs by roles and the salaries that companies are hiring for. If I were to guess, and this might be a terrible guess, would be 50 to 60 or more based on experience. I know that once you're into your career and get more senior level, it can rise upwards of 100 over time. And then larger companies, like I have a friend that works at Home Depot, and as a probably the most senior level designer, but not yet managing, is like well over 100. So the salaries for UX can go to what I think are a pretty decent place. Okay. Yep. What have I learned most from Kyra? Well, I hadn't worked in the public sector until working with Kyra. So the whole process that I outlined with the RFPs and the responses, and then that what's the as is, what's the to be, that whole way of building things was new to me. I would like to kind of continue to push not back, but deeper with that process. So I'm still kind of learning about that. Um, this isn't necessarily the core of your question, but just practically speaking, Kyra is now going deep into the way of a product named Salesforce, gigantic CRM, and we're beginning to help governments use Salesforce to do what they do. So I'm learning a lot about Salesforce and how to try to integrate UX into that tool. And then I guess the other type of learning that I'm doing would be project-based. Like, what are you working on? One of the projects that I'm most interested in is a communication application for like the Florida's Turnpike and the interstate system. And it's going to enable state agencies to DOT to communicate event warnings, kind of like Waze and Google Maps do, but through the state, using all of these sensors that are going to be integrated throughout the highway system, kind of like the cameras are now, but a lot more sensors and devices are on their way, and we're helping them use them to communicate for vehicle safety and all of that. So I'm learning about the ways of communicating to vehicles in all of that world. But that's more project-based learning than like learning about UX proper. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah, I will. Cool. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Bye.